You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Disney's Lilo & Stitch has finally landed on Disney+. Now you can watch the global phenomenon at home with your Ohana.
Be good for 1 second.
Lilo & Stitch is verified hot on Rotten Tomatoes with an audience score of 93%.
Perfect.
Stitch is also cute and fluffy.
Disney's Lilo & Stitch, rated PG, now streaming on Disney+. And right now, you can get Disney+, Hulu, and all of ESPN with an incredible limited-time offer. Terms apply.
Okay, so I wanted to tell a story that didn't make it into the episode 4, The Pistol and the Transom, and a story about the headshake that changed American politics. It also has to do with political violence, and it has to do with the idea of assigning blame for an episode of political violence to opponents or not doing so. Something that America was faced with in 1881 in a very real way. Let's start with the story. As we talked about in the last Chester Arthur series episode 4, and if you didn't listen to that, you should. James Garfield is shot in July 1881 in a train station. He's supposed to go to New Jersey to his summer house to visit his wife. He's accompanied by the Secretary of State, James Blaine, when a madman, Charles Guiteau, screaming crazy things, shoots him. He fires twice with the pistol, hits James Garfield in the head. A police officer arrests him, and he says, "I am a stalwart." This refers to a faction within the Republican Party that is not James Garfield's faction. And Arthur is now president. He has just invoked the name of the vice president, saying that he did this to make Arthur president. A lot there. That's not helpful to Chester Arthur, who's vice president and who has nothing to do with this at all, and is in New York at the current time. He does briefly come down to D.C. and then goes back to New York because he doesn't want to seem like he's taking advantage of an opportunity. In 1881, the law is the same as it is today in some ways. You don't have the 25th Amendment, but still, if the president is unable in any capacity to assume the duties of the presidency, the vice president assumes those duties. However, given the political situation, given how delicate things were, Chester Arthur goes back to New York. And so what happens with the federal government is that James Blaine, the Secretary of State and kind of the elder statesman and also the most important position of the cabinet at this time, the way it would have been seen, the guy who's responsible for foreign relations, runs the cabinet meetings, keeps Vice President Chester Arthur informed of things during the summer while James Garfield is recuperating, or so they hope. Now, a very important event occurs right after the shooting at the police station. A reporter goes up to James Blaine, who is right by Garfield's side, and says, "Do you think Chester Arthur, or his political boss, Senator Roscoe Conkling, who is engaged in the struggle with the president at this very moment over his Senate seat and other things, do you think that they had anything to do with this?" And James Blaine just simply shakes his head. And according to the reporter's account, he doesn't even say the words no, he just simply shakes his head. And for official Washington, for the media and things like that, people who cover politics, that's probably enough. And say, okay. Now, a couple of things to know. On one hand, when he shakes his head, Blaine does not know that Guiteau, the madman, had made this statement to the police officer about being a stalwart and Arthur becoming president. On the other hand, another thing to know is that James Blaine does know this madman. Guiteau has come to the Secretary of State's office, acted like an idiot with the staff, kept demanding a job for all that he did to help Blaine be in that office, and Blaine tells him, "Get out of here and never come back." He personally throws him out. So Blaine knows full well that this is a crazy man. Blaine's actions and the general sense that this was a lone actor is what will lead to most people concluding in the political world of 1881 that Chester Arthur, Roscoe Conkling are people of the stalwart faction, even if they may have benefited politically, even if Arthur might become president soon, that they had nothing to do with this. Roscoe Conkling, for his part, Chester Arthur, for his part, do not speak to this. Conkling says, I have nothing to answer for in the ramblings of a madman. And he doesn't say that publicly. That's what he says to friends. How close do you get? Some in the media suggest that the battles between the stalwarts and the half-breeds, and you have to remember, this would be as strong as any kind of party battles we have today between Democrats and Republicans. These guys did not like each other. The New York Tribune frames the shooting as the product of a spirit cultivated by political faction. He was not shot by a political faction, the Tribune says of Garfield, but by a spirit which a political faction has begotten and nursed. And that's Whitelaw Reid, friend of President Garfield, friend of James Blaine, later going to be a Republican VP candidate, editor of the Tribune. A kind of indirect blame. There are newspapers who say this. The Cincinnati Enquirer, a Republican newspaper, does tie Arthur's name to the assassin's motives, though doesn't tie Arthur to the assassin. They call Guiteau's crime the crime of the century, which a lot of Americans would agree it was at that time. They're horrified by it. And they mock the hip pocket politician. This would be a politician who acts, using his gun, using violence, or seeking kind of low thug jobbery type things as might have been seen in New York, Chicago, or Cincinnati political machines, as opposed to the great oratory or great cultured and debate in the Senate. The Brooklyn Eagle, on the other hand, chides other newspapers or even hinting that the stalwarts might have had something to do with this. They tell readers, please don't lose your heads to excitement. Pity is a more appropriate response because Guiteau has more brain disease than malice. They condemn reports tending to create the impression that Guiteau was the tool of a conspiracy. Citing the New York Tribune, the Brooklyn Eagle says that according to Secretary Blaine's view, in all of this we have common sense, common decency, and evidence that honor sits firmly on the seat. It rebukes those who indulge suspicions against men like Conkling, who is spoken of as a man above either stimulating assassination or profiting by it. Such notions, the Eagle says, are villainous in their effects upon the community, and most assuredly the opposite of credible. The Eagle talks about a speech at Tompkins Square Park in New York on July 5th, 1881. This would have been 2 days after the shooting. Reverend Bernard Peters is speaking in Tompkins Square, and the Eagle was mocking him for being groggy, for being dazed. Bernard Peters also is a journalist, and he writes in the East District Times, which is a Brooklyn newspaper. National troubles in the party now in power led to the assassination of President Garfield, known to the man to stand up for Arthur for president. It was not a Democrat, not even a Southern Democrat, that murdered or attempted to murder our president. It was a man who cried, I am a stalwart of the stalwarts, and we shall now have Arthur for president. Meanwhile, in the Cincinnati Enquirer, a poem by William T. Armstrong. God save our chief, a people's prayer, loud lifted every heart and sea, a stricken nation's wailings voiced upon universal air. God save our chief's a people's prayer, loud lifted every heart and sea, a stricken nation's wailings voiced on universal air. And in the mighty plant hath died all note of faction's bitter pride, and he that yesterday had lost his party will to party's side, today cast his voice high grandly blent with that high swelling patriot plea, God save the president. Assail thus the coward hand, not him by baseless malice known, strike solely down, but madly through, a nation's giant heart hath flown. Here is no land of lord and czar, stern wrestling with a people's will, a poisoned fount of treachery's ill that severs the wild despot's war. No state with care uneasy load that feels the despot's iron road, then turns for the crime. But here, within her chosen bound, doth freedom take her open road, while deep within her breast is found the generous pulse of brotherhood, that throbbing in an honest sublime thrills through the round continent, and freemen's hearts to freemen's blood. Songs all save freemen's noblest wood. God save the president. These are the type of poems that would have been in newspapers, and you don't have TV, I remind you, no radio yet. Just starting to get telephones. There's nothing but, poems to be read at times like this, to mourn, that might have been read in public affairs, in public events. That's all. I thought it was interesting to mention it. We're in a time where this is much discussed, this general issue. I offer no comparisons or contrast in this particular story, other than to say that emotions at one time could have been felt at a different time in American history, and leave it at that. Hope you're enjoying the story of Chester Arthur. This is a 5-part series, so there will be a final one on the time that we don't hear a lot about, and that's when Arthur is actually president. Interested in hearing more on the Patreon? We got plenty more. www.myhistorycanbeatupyourpolitics. Patreon. If you like My History Can Beat Up Your Politics, please give me a review, particularly on Apple Podcasts, but wherever you listen, I appreciate it.
In New York in 1968, some group of New Yorkers, after midnight, would have tuned in to WBAI radio. BAI would play music, underground music, and it'd also have very left-wing news and viewpoints. WBAI is still on the air. I used to listen to it in the 90s. But in 68, it would air conspiracy theories, like it'd have people on that seriously would say Lyndon Johnson was behind the assassination of JFK and go on for hours about it. As Charles Kaiser says in his book, 1968, it tested the FCC's patience. Most importantly, a WBAI would have a daily accounting of war news, daily diary, just listing what happened in raw terms. As Kaiser said, absent the television pictures of running, shooting soldiers, a daily diary read into a microphone of war news gave the war a grim sheen that probably was more realistic than the television image. In 1967, Arlo Guthrie goes on WBAI and performs Alice's Restaurant, a simple story about a rural arrest for littering, along with a visit to the Army Induction Center mixed together with visits to Alice's wonderful restaurant. We can have anything you want. You can't have Alice. In a few minutes, Kaiser writes, Arlo had made the absurdity of youth logical and the logic of adults absurd. Alice is based on a real person, Alice Brock. She was an artist in New York, and when she got married, they moved up to Pittsfield, Massachusetts, but she retained a kind of bohemianness, and her husband obliged. Her husband was a woodshop teacher at a local college, and they had enough money to purchase an old abandoned church and turn it into kind of a center for bohemians. Today it lives on. It's in Great Barrington and lives on as the Guthrie Center. There doesn't appear to be a restaurant at first. Alice will later open several restaurants, but at first it seems to be after a Thanksgiving meal. And when Arlo Guthrie and another friend are depositing the garbage from the Thanksgiving meal, they're doing it at the wrong time. There's no dumping allowed in the town at that time. And they're arrested for their behavior. And that's where the story comes from. Her mother was so tired of all this talk about what she was doing for bohemians and art and all of this and said, open a restaurant. I taught you to cook. And so she did eventually. Wasn't open long. She tried things like after the song comes out, she tries things like a franchise of Alice's Restaurant. She tries a drive-through, which is moderately successful, and eventually a restaurant in the late 70s that has a disco floor right next to it. She'll stop restauranting in 1979. She never quite liked her fame, Alice Brock. It took till the 2000s, she said, to be comfortable with her role. The famous restauranting, that didn't last. One thing she always liked doing was a quiet hobby of painting rocks and then giving it to friends so that they could hide it in various parts of their home to be found later. Good Morning Cabal. Bob Fass. He had a show at midnight. It was music mixed with long commentary. Politics, culture, whatever. And he figured, if I'm here doing this, there must be listeners out there listening. And he's right. And he goes, if we could turn them into a tribe. And when you think about today's events with social media, people being called to do things, sometimes bad. This was an example of an interesting experiment with a guy who's been called like the hippie before there were hippies to just do weird things like, hey, everybody listening to this now, we're going to go to JFK where there's late arriving planes and just welcome the people, just like they do in Hawaii. We're going to greet them and clap for them. And he would get hundreds of people to show up at JFK Airport, different security rules at this time, and just clap for random people who are arriving in the planes. He'd eventually do more things, like he'd say, hey, there's this street that's really dirty. Let's go there in Avenue A and Avenue B and clean it up. And people would go and help clean it up. In one time, the sanitation department in New York is embarrassed. They don't want to hear that this random group of people are cleaning up the streets. And so when they hear about it, they get there early, and the trucks go up and down the street, and so there's nothing to clean up when they get there. In another case, there was a woman who was a listener who had a fire, and a crowd of people were summoned from his invisible tribe to help her, from his cabal to help her clean up after the fire. He came up with an idea and asked his engineers, can you make a contraption that will allow up to 10 listeners at the time to come on the phone and talk all at the same time? The station engineer, Mike Edel, built it. And it was a feature of his show. 10 people on, sometimes talking over each other, not always, but 10 people available to talk, having this like giant conversation. Those are the type of experimental things he would do. He'd play 2 records at a time. He'd play records backwards. He'd play the same song over again. And he'd keep listeners aware of all the events around 1968 in Chicago and what was going on with the presidential election, what Nixon was doing, what Johnson was doing, the war, and the trials that came after Chicago. He would have Abby Hoffman on talking, and then in one episode, he has Arlo Guthrie, and history's made. We remember Alice's Restaurant, but we don't remember as well about Bob Fass, but there have been documentaries made about him. He died, I believe, in 2021.
Thanks for listening.